There we go. What's going on, Jonathan?
Not much, man. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. How you doing?
I'm great. I appreciate you coming on, man. Been looking forward to it. A lot of people were asking if I could get you on. I think we're aligned on a few different things, right?
Yeah, I've poked around a few of your videos. I like your approach to training overall. Just taking biomechanics, anatomy, all that stuff into account is huge. I think you have a fresh perspective, I'd say, compared to like the majority of YouTube fitness, which is always nice.
Yeah, I think so. In this field, it's like in my field, like we're more of like pain management stuff. It's not like new, but I don't think there's a lot of people who are like applying the concepts that we would do like in clinic to the performance and to aesthetics as well. So I'm trying to bridge that gap a little bit. Tell me a little bit about you, man. What got you started on your fitness journey? Like how long you been working out? Where are you from? Tell me a little bit about your background.
So I started lifting, well, I started bodybuilding or like training for hypertrophy. I don't compete in 2016. So it's been about 8 years. A little bit of time
And
off.
how old were you?
I actually just turned 26 the other day. So I
Oh,
was
cool.
probably 18 when I started, something like that,
Nice.
17, 18. A little bit of time off. I was in high school, so I played hockey, took a little time off for that and kind of lost some gains, but they came back quick. Took 5 or 6 months off back in 2021, I believe, and then kind of have been rebuilding since then. Other than that, it's been pretty consistent. Not the best training all around. A lot of mistakes, lots of things I got right, a lot of mistakes too, like anyone, I guess. And I've kind of talked about those mistakes, critiqued the fitness industry, and what led me to fall down certain traps within training. And that's a lot of what my channel's about these days. But yeah, other than that, that's pretty much it. Always had a main focus on hypertrophy. Spent a lot of time in powerlifting because I was basically told by the fitness industry that's the way to train for bodybuilding, and kind of ironically, it's not.
Yeah.
So what I talk about these days.
Nice. Where you live? You're playing hockey. Atlas had asked he wanted to ask if you ever saw Bigfoot. So you must be somewhere pretty far up north. Where are you at?
So I'm in Maine. He
In
uh
Maine?
he jokes around that I'm Canadian because for some reason I kind of have a slight Canadian accent.
I can hear it. Yeah, I don't know why.
I don't know why I do. I've never been to Canada, but I do get a lot of comments, like genuinely, like at least once a month, someone will comment like, "Oh," or like, "Are you Canadian?" Or someone will say like, "Oh, happy Thanksgiving." I got a couple of those the other day, and like for Canadian Thanksgiving, I was
Yeah,
I was like, "Wait a second. Oh, it's Canadian Thanksgiving."
that's
I even have
funny.
clients text me that sometimes too. It is pretty funny. I get a kick out of it.
So is this your full-time gig? You're on YouTube and you're doing online coaching?
Yeah, it has been for a year and a half at this point, actually, which is great. I'm super fortunate, definitely pretty lucky to do what I do. And yeah, it is what I do full time. So training, obviously, YouTube, channel's not huge or anything, but a little bit of ad revenue here and there. Couple sponsorships and online coaching. I keep it simple, and that's enough to pay the bills and whatnot.
Do you do anything in person or is it all online right now?
It's all online. I used to train in person. I actually started doing that when I was like 18 or 19. I kind of have always worked in gyms. And then I managed a gym for a while, did a tiny little bit of training along with that. And then as I was managing the gym, I started making this channel, and then it started to take off a little bit during that time. And I was like, you know what? I was like working two full-time jobs. I'm like, oh, obviously I'm going to pick the channel. I'm not going to leave you
Yeah.
guys hanging. So, and obviously
Was
better
that
for my time too. So.
Oh yeah, way better too for your mental. I'm sure. Like, were you at a big like corporate gym or was it a smaller gym chain?
Yeah, it was a gym chain, but it wasn't a particularly like huge gym. It wasn't like a gold gym or anything like that, just kind of a generic commercial gym. So it wasn't really my demographic. It wouldn't be people like me or you. It's kind of just general population, which is fine. And I enjoy working with those types of people, but uh not the people I necessarily enjoy to work with the most. Like I love to train not competitive bodybuilders because I'm not a genius on prepping. Like I don't have experience coaching for competition or like hyper analyzing a specific physique and making sure that everything's in proportion for what a bodybuilding judge would want within whatever division they're training for. But yeah, general hypertrophy, where it's like you're not just training to get bigger and stronger, but it's like, yeah, you want to get big, you want to look like a bodybuilder, but you don't want to necessarily cater to what the judges want, whether that's leanness, proportions, even the lower body. Like most people that aren't competing in bodybuilding don't care as much about their legs. I think
Yeah.
a lot of people that do compare about that do care about competitive bodybuilding care about their legs because they care about the result. But if they were to never compete again, like I know for me personally, I would be like, all right, one leg session a week, just maintain a medium size and then specialize in upper body stuff. I think that's how most people probably are.
Is that what you do right now?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
I go through phases really. Like there's times where I want to train my legs more, and I'm like, you know what, I just want to like max out that FFMI. And I know if I don't have my legs like up to their potential, then obviously I'm being held back quite a bit. And there's times where it's just fun to train legs too. Like I think I mean, you get it. Like as you advance as a lifter, you have an appreciation for intensity and hard training, and then obviously leg training. It's a very standardizable way to train super, super hard and go super heavy. And it's like that's not exactly what I enjoy most, but I think there's an appreciation you gain for it. I certainly have for leg training, and that's pretty much it. Other than that, I definitely go through phases. It's probably half the time where I'm only doing one leg session a week. And I'll always train them hard, but I'm never worried about like optimizing things aside from like effort and technique, really. I'm not going to try and like pump up my volume or get my
Yeah.
frequency check and maximize that, you know?
Were you like when did you start your YouTube? Were you doing that like pretty much as soon as you were starting your journey? You waited a while? Like how did you start that?
So this channel I started, it was February of 2022. So that would have been 5 or 6 years into my like overall lifting career. And at the time, I'm not like super advanced or anything right now, but I've made a lot of progress since then. At that time, I was kind of just like halfway through the intermediate stage, maybe even like a little bit earlier in intermediate. Um, and I had learned a lot from my mistakes, and I kind of developed a very specific training philosophy on what, all right, over the past 6 years, it seems like a small sample size, but I'm very observant. I take it very seriously. I learned quite a bit just from reflection, observing other lifters, and learning what did not work for me. And since then, I've kind of been talking about those exact things throughout the course of the channel. And yeah, I mean, I try to talk the talk and walk the walk. Like I don't want to be the guy that's just like telling other people what to do, but like I clearly am not progressing my training. Like one, even if the information was good, I think there's a YouTube and relaying good information isn't just about telling people what to do. It's about showing them how to do it and inspiring them to do it as well. So while my channel will never be like a vlogging channel, or it's never going to be specifically about me, it's always going to be about the training and the methods. I think being able to kind of show that as like like a secondary part of the channel is huge. And it's something that I wanted to do it just because I wanted to show people like, yeah, what I talk about does work and I practice what I preach. I'm not just like trying to come up with these things for clicks or views or anything. Like this is genuinely how I train. That's gotten a lot more like attention and respect than I ever thought it would. Like I made the Road to 18-inch arm series and I thought that would just be like the most boring thing ever, but everyone was like glued onto that and they loved it. People still talk about it. I'm like, you know what? Like people enjoy that kind of stuff. And I feel like since I've been in the fitness industry forever, like I don't want to say I've been there, done that, but I've seen the guy that makes this transformation. Then you see another guy that makes the transformation. It's like you've seen it 1,000 times, and like, well, I'm just another one of those. But a lot of people really do like to pay attention to that stuff, which I didn't really know when I started the series, but it turned out to be pretty cool, I think, for a lot of people.
The arms is a little different too, right? It's easy to make like a transformation just by losing body fat and looking really good, but for a natty to actually like pump up his arms to over 18, I think that definitely gives a little more street cred for sure. So we
I
can
hope
go into
so.
that. Yeah, because I'm like I had GVS on there, and he said the same thing too. It's kind of similar starting as you did. Like he was kind of like intermediate, and then decided to start his YouTube and realized like there was a lot more he didn't even know, and he's learning as he's going and teaching these guys as you're going. I think people really appreciate that. Like as you guys expand your knowledge base and they get to see that, I think they put more trust in you guys. So you two are probably you two got the biggest natty arms, right? You and GVS, you're the only two over 18 pretty much that are like out there.
Um, I mean, there's definitely competitive bodybuilders out there. I
Yeah,
would say
yeah.
on YouTube. I'm trying to think of anyone else. Well, there's natural hypertrophy. I'm pretty sure he has 18-inch arms.
Yeah.
I'd say, yeah, it's pretty much just as far as like YouTubers or like content creators, I think it might just be me and GVS, then obviously natural hypertrophy. There might be a couple more that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. Bald Donnie Man might be. If he's not there, he's close. Um, I can't think of anyone else off the top of my head. I know there's others though.
And so I was hearing people were saying that you kind of spammed preacher curls. Like, what was your secret? What was the main thing that you did to
Yeah.
get you? Because you went from what, like 17 and a half? Is that what you were starting at?
So yeah, basically, just to give you like the whole bigger picture, I was hyper focused on bodybuilding when I first started off my training. Just good old bodybuilding. It was very entry level stuff. I had a general idea of what to do. I trained better than most beginners, but I didn't quite understand everything yet. But overall, it was fundamentally sound. As I creeped towards that late beginner stage, kind of early intermediate stage of lifting, I fell for the power building trap, as I like to call it, where you just get people say the only way to get bigger, the fastest way to get big, especially if you're natural, is just to get you have to get stronger. You have to have the biggest squat bench deadlift you can, just get those numbers big, and you'll like it's impossible not to be fully developed and big once you have a big squat bench deadlift. So I fell hard for that. Got a 600 whatever deadlift, 455 squat, friends FaceTime me. Let me hang up on that real quick. And then 330 bench or something, which
Oh,
was
wow.
ironically, I've gotten a much better bench just from bodybuilding and not hyper fixating on powerlifting. And then from there, my arms plateaued between 16 and 16 and a half inches. And I was like, all right, something's not adding up. Like I'm strong across the board pretty much on everything. My bench was probably a little bit behind my squat and deadlift, but I was stronger than pretty much anyone at any gym, especially compared to other naturals. And I was like, all right, like how much more, like, do I have to get an 800 deadlift to get bigger biceps? Do I have to get like a 50 bench to get 18-inch arms? Like at what point are we just going to focus on hypertrophy instead of saying, oh, just accept that it's a side effect of getting stronger? And of course, the two are correlated. And that's if for anyone that doesn't know my channel, that might seem like a little bit strange out of context. But once I plateaued at 16, 16 and a half inches for a long time, I was like, all right, something's off. And then I started to just forget everything that I had learned from other people and just analyzed my own training. What I realized was that you can take, like, say, the basics that you see across the board in most bodybuilding programs. You take something uh like a flat press, barbell, Smith machine press, whatever it is, a flat press. It's stable. It has an opposing force on your back, and it's length and bias just because the internal strength curve. So you have a lot of tension down at the bottom. I'm not saying you have to get a crazy stretch. I made a video on that as well, which is another fallacy, I believe, to a degree, but it's a nice length and bias, very hard at the bottom. It gets a little bit easier as you press just because your elbows come in. The moment arm decreases a little bit. And I was like, all right, that makes sense. Squat, pretty much the same thing. Like you take hack squat, leg press, even a barbell squat, they're all stable. Your feet are going into the ground, which acts as the opposing force. The implement you're using will have overall a good amount of stability, but it will vary between whether you're using barbell or hack squat or something. From there, mostly hard at the bottom due to the internal strength curve, and then it gets a little bit easier as you go to the lockout. And I started noticing these consistencies on these like quote unquote basic exercises. When I looked at something like the biceps, I would say, okay, well, a barbell curl is what's known as like the most basic exercise for the biceps because it's a barbell and you can add 5 pounds easily. And it kind of got me thinking, well, that doesn't have the same basic principles that a squat, bench, or deadlift or any other basic quote unquote exercise has that most people talk about within kind of the fitness social media community. So I said, okay, well, if we take the principles of, say, bench press or a variation of a flat press, that would probably be a little bit closer, a little bit, yeah, related a little bit more close to something like a preacher curl. So instead of a barbell curl, which one is short biased, it's not as stable because there's not an opposing force or stability behind your elbows. And on top of that, the lift actually changes as you get stronger. So if you're 175 pounds and you're curling a 65-pound bar, that's not really enough to kind of like pull you forwards or push you back depending on where you're at in the range of motion. But if you're 175 pounds and you're curling 135, which if you have big arms, you're going to be curling 135, at that point, you almost have, what is that, 80% of your body weight, a forearm's distance in front of you, which is going to pull you forwards. And to compensate for that, you have to lean back and shift around your elbows. It changes the lift entirely because it's not a very stable lift. It's also mid to short biased, so you get peak tension at the top. And I'm not even trying to say that all muscles grow better at longer lengths, but if you look at the elbow flexors in particular, strongly suggests that biceps have better tension and better leverage at longer lengths. So if you take something like a preacher curl, once it's stable, just like a press with the back support or a squat with the ground under your feet, uh, it's also length and biased because of the resistance profile and that 45-degree pad. So that started to make a little bit more sense. And I was like, you know what? That's the lift that just makes the most sense, like on paper. And then in practice, standardizable. And you can also use progressive overload as you need to. Like for some reason, people think it has to be a regular barbell curl to focus on progressive overload, which just isn't true. Of course, it's going to be slow because you can't cheat since it's a preacher. But ultimately, that was the lift that brought me to 18-inch arms. Obviously, there's the triceps, which is the other half of the equation. But for biceps, that's the bread and butter. Absolutely.
And so what kind of like technique are you using? Right? Are you like locking out? Or are you going right before lockout? I think you get a little shoulder flexion right when I watch it. That's a little bit of long head that'll help with that too. Can you
Yeah,
explain your
so
technique a little bit?
yeah, it's both. Most of the Road to 18-inch arms series was not a full lockout. It was close. It was way well beyond peak tension, but it wasn't full lockout. At this point, I am going full lockout. I've reduced the weights a little bit, but I am going full lockout. Sometimes I'm doing it with a pause, just for a little bit more standardization, and because why not? And it might also help with like injury prevention. I'm not talking bicep tears. I'm just talking like forearm splints, which is fairly common with preacher curls, and that's pretty much what I'm doing now for I'd say 80-90% of my preacher curl work.
And what kind of like rep range and sets were you doing in frequency as well?
Yeah, twice a week, pretty much. As far as volume goes, it was between 4 and 8 sets a week for the most part, and rep ranges were 5 to 7 for the bulk of my like heavier work with preachers. But I would go up to 8 or 9 on occasion if I was going a little bit lighter. That just to try and avoid like forearm splints, basically.
And with these, do you do any like intensity techniques or with anything in general? I know a lot of natties. Are you big on doing any kind of like drop set or partials or anything like that?
For short bias lifts, yeah.
Yeah.
For stuff that's length and bias, I just by the time you hit zero RIR failure, like you're just smoked. I mean, obviously you get it. Like it's like trying to do partials on bench is what it feels like trying to do
Yeah.
partials on preacher curls. For short bias stuff, yeah, I'll do some of that for sure. So like dumbbell side raises, I'll do length and partials on strict cable curls or strict dumbbell curls where I'm just doing like uh no change in resistance profile, just hubris vertical straight up and down. Once I can't get past parallel, I'll continue to do some partials past that. But other than that, nothing too crazy for intensity techniques.
Were there any other bicep moves or that was it? That was the solo.
That's the bread and butter, but I did add in some variety. There's no lift that can really just encapsulate every function of a muscle. So I always like to promote at least including a little bit of variety, whether that's something that complements the preacher curl or something that does something similar, but just changes it a little bit just to keep you a little bit fresher. What I would suggest is, since the preacher curl is so length and biased, what I would do is pick something that's maybe short biased, or pick something that puts your elbow in a different position, maybe by your side or behind you, just to train different parts of the muscle from maybe a different resistance profile, or train the muscle at an overall different length, because of course it attaches at the shoulder too. It may be something that trains supination instead of just being locked into supination. That could be another good option, but those would all be kind of I would say secondary if preacher curls are going to be your like main lift. So what I would normally do there is 2 to 3 sets on preachers and then 1 set of another variation. And if you're like more advanced and you need more variation and you can recover from it, then maybe one more set of one other variation to kind of complement what the preacher curl might miss out on.
And you were doing tries with buys or were tries a separate thing?
It would be separate. So the one thing that I've never really talked about that could potentially be at least somewhat helpful in the road to getting bigger arms. Um, okay, so the split itself, it was a push-pull legs, but I swapped biceps and triceps. I only did one leg day a week just to save me a little bit of energy, and legs are lower priority. So that would technically increase the frequency at which I would train elbow flexion and extension if you're counting like at least getting some of that movement from pushing and pulling, not probably not enough to grow, but enough to at least keep the stimulus going a little bit as far as like not letting muscle loss happen between sessions potentially. But other than that, I do think being fresh for those sessions was kind of a game changer because if you're done with an entire push day, like trying to optimize your tricep training after that, the way I see it is your triceps are like they're kind of fatigued, but they're not quite fully stimulated since they haven't got a whole ton of work super close to failure. But you're probably not fresh enough to get max motor unit recruitment anyways. So I do think swapping the two around was pretty helpful. I had a little bit of worry about like injury and whatnot, or just overuse injury and whatnot, but I never ran into any issues aside from just a little bit of forearm splints with preacher curls, which is very easily manageable through like a temporary rotation for 2 to 4 weeks with something that has a little bit more freedom at the wrist, I find.
And then were you like doing your buys tries at the start of the workout, or were you just doing those towards the end?
I do them at the end, and that's something that everyone is like, "Oh, well, you should do them at the start if you want to prioritize your arms." But it didn't make a difference. Like my performance would be the same either way, even if I was feeling like sensationally like a little bit tired. It wouldn't make a difference in my performance at all. So I had no reason to switch it around, and I was like, I'd rather save the fun stuff for the end and get through my boring presses and delt work
Oh
before I
man,
get more
you're
enjoyable
like the
work.
opposite of me. I can push and do delts all day. I fucking hate doing arms. Just one joint action. Let's just do everything off of that one joint. What were
Oh,
the
I enjoy
tricep
it.
moves that you were mainly employing?
So triceps would be mostly through the Smith machine JM press, and the JM press, it's obviously a hybrid lift, so there's a bunch of different variations. But just to get a quick baseline of my technique, it would be shoulder joint width grip, so relatively narrow if you're talking about presses as a whole, and it would be bar path to my chin. So obviously it's going to change a little bit based on your preference and your arm length, but basically to reverse engineer that, I just want my elbow to be above my shoulder but below my wrist from the side view when you're at the bottom, aka at peak tension. So if your elbow is below your shoulder, that's still a good amount of elbow bend overall, but of course it's going to be a little bit more biased towards like a close grip bench of that hybrid lift. And then vice versa, if you're going a little bit too high to where your elbow is above your wrist, that's a little bit more biasing towards a skull crusher. So going right in between that keeps peak tension at the bottom. And the philosophy behind that, just to keep it quick here, is in the vast majority of tricep work or compound presses, your elbows don't really go beyond 90 degrees. And if you do, it's very little tension. So if you're talking like an overhead extension or a push down, peak tension is, of course, at 90 degrees. Some people try and get full ROM, but of course, the moment arm shrinks so much to where there's basically no tension. So when you take a JM press and you kind of change that resistance profile, now peak tension's all the way down here. It's like a completely novel training stimulus for the vast majority of lifters that train just how normal lifters in the gym train. So I think that's part of it. Um, and I would say, yeah, kind of that range of motion and that length and bias is something that is lacking in most lifts for the triceps.
So you would say the biggest changes you made overall to like your approach to arms would just to be to find some stability component and really focus on the lengthened kind of tension.
Yeah, well, but yeah, so having peak tension at a longer overall length, I think is key, especially when you look at the biceps. Triceps, I anecdotally found that that does help quite a bit. It might not, I'm not exactly able to explain why. It could just be something as simple as novelty. It could be something as simple as it's just a bigger range of motion and tension never really comes off the triceps. So therefore you can activate more muscle fibers. But all I can say is that it definitely worked.
And then as far as like your workouts, like are you doing everything like in the basement? Is that your thing? You're like you work out
Pretty
at your
much.
place? You ever
Yeah,
go to the
I got
gym
a
at
bunch of
all?
stuff down here, man. I've got
Yeah, what's
I
your
can give you
setup?
a quick
Yeah.
little tour, but this is the start. So single cable tower, got the leg
Nice.
press, which I want to sell because the weight capacity is low. That's why I've got the band. This is the legendary preacher curl right here. Titan power rack. Got a hammer strength. Here, I'll flip it to this side.
Oh, you got the
Hammer
jammer arms
strength,
too, right? Yeah.
supinated pull down. Yeah, jammer arm. So it's a supinated pull down and super incline or high incline press or whatever on that side. Dip station that shouldn't be there. Got the beautiful Smith machine right here. Got a little lat pull down there's a little T-bar row standing one over
Oh,
here that I
nice.
don't know if I can quite see on the camera. And then there's a beautiful Cybex selectorized pack deck back there that I
Oh,
got for an absolute steal on Marketplace a year ago.
nice. When did you build
Yeah.
this out? How long have you had this set up?
Oh, I bought I bought gym equipment before I bought a couch. So I got the house and it was March of 2021. The first thing I bought was a bench that I found on Marketplace. So it started as pretty much just right where the preacher curl is now. I had a little bench there with a standard 300-pound barbell set from Dick's. And then slowly but surely, of course, a home gym never ends. So I bought most of the stuff in 2021, 2022, and I've got some other like bigger pieces last year and this year. And I'm in the process of trying to get a chest supported T-bar row, and I'll probably sell my leg press, kind of running out of space here. But yeah, it's a super fun project. Do you have like a home gym or anything?
No, I owned a gym right by me. I just got out of the gym business. That's why I started going online. And I mean, my gym was sick, but it was, it was like a minute from me, so it might have well been a home gym. But no, I'm
Hmm.
always jealous of basements. I lived in Texas and now I'm in California, so I never had access to them. I always thought they were like cool. You watch TV, it's like where the, teenagers go down and have their parties, like make out and stuff. And then, it always seemed like
Yeah.
guys turned into man caves, and you see really cool
Yeah.
gyms out there. I'm always like, ah, man. We got hurricanes, so basements would not work that good where I'm from.
Oh, what part of California are you from?
Oh, I'm talking about from Texas, but I'm in
Oh,
Southern
okay, yeah.
Cal right now. I'm in like Orange County, Newport Beach area, which is paradise. We don't have anything here. There's some fires that happen close to us, and some earthquakes, but we seem to be okay. Everything else be
Yeah,
burning around us.
right. Okay, so wait, do you have a basement where you're at now?
No, no.
Okay,
California doesn't
yeah,
usually have basements.
right. If you do end up getting a house with a basement, I would just, if you plan on getting a home gym, try and get something with higher ceilings because I've got 7 foot ceilings here. Nightmare to try and get
Yeah.
stuff that's here. So like I had to get the short version of the cable tower. I had to get the short version of the power rack. The Smith machine right here is up in the rafters. I didn't even finish the ceiling because I knew it wouldn't fit. So I just have like these are just like blankets that I tacked up. It looked okay-ish, but I was like, if I'm gonna have equipment kind of poking up into the rafters, then yeah, obviously I have to allow for a little bit of flexibility there. But I guess there's a silver lining to everything, and that would be that half of my subscribers think I'm like 6'5" because I'm almost as tall as they think.
Right? Is it like open to like the outdoors? Is it easy to get equipment in there? You don't have to bring it through your house, do you?
I have a bulkhead. It is a little bit small since it's obviously shorter ceilings. It's a pain, but it's doable. Like I've got everything that I have here. I've gotten down here. The Smith machine was a bitch to get down here. I did it. It was an impulsive purchase. It would have been almost 2 years ago at this point, but holy shit, that thing's so heavy. I did it all by myself. Girlfriend was at work. I didn't even know I was buying it until an hour before I left work. I had nothing left to do at the gym, so I was just like per usual scrolling Facebook Marketplace, and I found a Smith machine 30 minutes away for like $400, and I was like, "All right, I'm getting that."
Yeah,
Wasn't
that's
really
awesome.
planning on it, but I was like, "All right, well, truck's empty. I'm going right after work to pick that thing up." That was brutally, brutally hard to get down here. It was in the middle of winter too, so it was all snowy, but I got it together. Probably took 4 hours to assemble and whatnot. I mean, you owned a gym, so you might know
We
how.
moved, I moved a bunch of shit, man.
Yeah. Oh, you
So
get it.
much.
Oh, Smith machines are nightmares too, trying to get the bar over those poles and trying to
Dude.
balance that. Like I should have just waited for someone else, but I was like, I'm so dead set on hitting some Smith bench before work tomorrow, so I just have to make it happen. That's where I some things I have a lot of patience for, some things I don't. So that was one of the things where I did not have good patience.
Oh no, I'm terrible at it too. I had a lot of Prime at my old gym, and so they had to ship it in two shipments because like part of it was taking way longer than the others. And so the first shipment we just handled ourselves, and it was a shit show. I had all my trainers. I paid them some hourly, and it's like we had. Are you familiar with any of the Prime equipment? They have that their cable setup where you can
Yeah.
like plug in the seed and you can do the rows and all that.
Mhm.
So that thing was just horrible getting in and putting together, and then after that, I was like, okay, we definitely have to hire some help. And we got like these guys that were like they're literally on meth when they came to like help. We had hired them through U-Haul, but they weren't the strongest, but they had utter disregard for their personal safety. So they ended up
Yeah.
helping a lot. But yeah, I've had some major aches and pains from moving gym equipment over the years. Now, did
Yeah.
you get like
It
equal growth from your biceps, triceps? Or did you notice more from one or the other? Or you're
um
needing more of one or the other?
I would say probably a tad more with the biceps. I think part of it is the long head of the triceps. I left a little bit untapped, but overall good growth. I think if we're just talking like insertion wise, I think at this point I probably have somewhat of a good idea of just like my overall insertion, or I should say muscle belly genetics. I'm definitely more gifted for biceps and less gifted for triceps. That might play somewhat of a role, but I think I kind of, I don't want to say cracked the code for biceps, but I kind of understand like I've seen very, very clear progress more than I have in any other muscle group in my time lifting since doing preacher curls and kind of specializing in those. Triceps, I think I have another level to tap into. I'm not ready to submit to the genetics excuse yet. I think there is more room to grow. I just have to still kind of figure out what that might be, whether it's just continuing with JM presses. My lateral and medial heads have seen a good amount of growth from that, but I think the long head, I still have to figure something out with that. I don't know if I've discovered that yet.
I know GVS on his whole arm series, he's real big on spamming the
Oh,
overhead, which I
yeah.
I like playing with those too. You can get some really good angles on there. And speaking of him, it's funny you mentioned earlier about how you thought you had to have, the big three lifts, and he's a good example of someone who's I think he's got a pretty solid dad, but he talks about his lifts are pretty shitty. If you were to look at his
Yeah.
his totals, and he's probably one of the best built natty guys there are. So that really goes to your point there.
Oh yeah, his physique's crazy. It's the point where like people, so many people think he's not even natural, and it's like not to take anything away from him, but it's like if you look at the top natural competitive bodybuilders, like he's on their level, and I think people just don't quite realize that, but it's like no, he like genuinely is a top natty guy, and like he didn't have to get these freaky strength numbers to get to that level. He just had to train properly and understand anatomy and train every muscle group super hard. Doesn't matter that he didn't do barbell squats to get massive quads the entire time. Doesn't matter that he never specialized in one rep max deadlifts and stuff like that. So it is a unique example, I think, and it was kind of it was almost like a little bit of a culture shock to a lot of people, I think.
Do you get many accusations now that you're over the 18-inch barrier? How often do you people accuse you or ask you?
I would say more often than not, people think I'm natty. I don't think I'm lean enough to get fake natty accusations. My guess is like if I was to do some cut to like 12% and I would look so much smaller, but God forbid I be shredded, or of course you have to be on gear. So uh
That's it's
it,
so funny.
it's so odd to me. It's like it's completely backwards from just my personal instinct. Like I would just going into the fitness industry, I would always correlate like, oh, he's big, that means steroids. If he's not as big, regardless of how shredded he is, that means he's probably more likely to be natural. It is very strange. But not really. I got posted on the Reddit Natty or Juice page, and I did a video reacting to it just because I knew the people that follow my channel would get a kick out of that, and obviously I did too. I thought it was hilarious. I would say it was probably 75-80% were saying I was natty, which was better than I thought considering
Were
the
these people
platform.
that know you, or these are just people that don't even know you?
Most people probably didn't know me. So that was I think a good thing because sometimes like obviously if someone knows my channel and they see how seriously I take training, then I think they'd be like, okay, yeah, this guy probably is natty. He's not just like going in for a quick lift after work and doesn't really care about it. It's like no, this is what he does, so makes sense. Um, but yeah, there were a good amount of people on that, if I remember correctly, that were saying like, not natty, no way. Look at those arms. It's like, all right, well, his natties with bigger arms than me, so I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people just never been really exposed to like true freaks of nature and things like that because the genetic the spectrum is very wide. There's some
Yeah,
freaks out there that you would never think are natty that are. And like I'm not a genetic freak at all, but I have really just natural separation. I think like good separation. I've always been lean, and I mean everybody accused me of juice ever since I was like 17 up till I was 22 and actually like started something at 23. And I was 165 to 170 pounds. It was just like you said, just the leanness and the separation.
yeah, yeah. If you have like that, I don't know if it's just like the way your muscle bellies are genetically shaped, or obviously the way you train is going to play a big role, or just your overall body fat distribution. It's like that can play a pretty big role in it too, I find, especially if you have big like delts, for example, where
Yeah.
most naturals like don't know how to train their delts properly or whatnot. Or they, I feel like most natties kind of have small rear delts, and it gives them that like super like natural, not supernatural, but just super
Yeah.
space natural look.
Yeah.
When natties do have big rear delts or just delts in general, and they're just like more advanced anyways, that's when people start to kind of accuse them. I also think you get a lot of people that kind of get pushed into like the mainstream fitness industry, and that's a lot of like intermediate level natural physiques that are people on gear. So you get people that look like your average, like pretty jacked natural, but they're like open about their steroid use. And you get a lot of people that are like, well, huh, if he's on gear, then anyone bigger than him can't be natural. But in reality, that guy just has no idea how to train properly. And he's only an intermediate because of the gear. So I see that quite a bit.
Yeah, if I get almost a little upset if someone asks me if I'm natural. I'm like I'm like I mean, hopefully you're just not super tied in, clued into the world. Because that's the worst.
There is one guy. There's one little quick story. One guy I knew, um, at a gym I worked at, not in Maine, but it was somewhere else. And he was telling me that he was like finishing up a cycle of tren, and I was like gave him a shocked look, like I thought he was kidding, and I was like, wait, oh shit, I feel kind of bad now. I was like, no, don't get me wrong, with you're jacked, I just would never guess that's what you're on.
Was he competing? Like Trent is such a like a crazy thing. I can't imagine. It blows my mind that people that aren't stepping on stage would ever touch that. You know what I mean? Like that is, it's the only thing that really, in my opinion, like plays into the whole like steroid culture. Like that's what gives you roid rage. Like whenever they talk about that, it's trend. Like trend's the one that
Yeah.
fucks up your head and is like you really want to do short term. I don't know why anyone. I hear about it all the time. These young kids like jumping on like a quick trend and they just break on cystic acne and get all psycho, but they don't really look any better. Like that's pretty nuts. Is that more recent over the last couple of years that these younger kids are pushing the harder stuff? Because I don't remember that when I was coming up.
I want to say it's probably like I'm gonna sound so old saying this, but it's probably from TikTok. I really steer clear of like the mainstream fitness industry. So sick of it, or mainstream social media fitness, I should say. Like I do myself. I just do my own channel, do my own thing. But I do still see like those mainstream influencers, they pop up on like my Instagram Explorer or whatever every now and then because it thinks that I want to see that. It looks like there's a lot of kids on gear. And it's like, well, when you take the fitness industry and you take social media and how just having a crazy physique can make you famous instantly and it seemingly would solve all the insecurities of a regular teenage kid. Like, yeah, I think that would make a lot of them want to hop on gear when it's probably not the best idea. And yeah, now it's like it's a reward system that the validation from social media kind of sets up for you, and it's doesn't necessarily give you the right incentives, I would say, at that age.
No,
It
no.
does seem to be more popular now. There were fake natties when I was coming up in the 2010s, but yeah, I'd say I wouldn't even say there's necessarily more fake natties now because it's kind of the cool thing to talk about gear.
But
But
they'll do low dose.
yeah,
Yeah.
low dose now, and it's probably not the lowest of
Yeah.
doses.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
I really steer clear of it though overall. It's like my whole thing is like I'm huge on natural training. The way I go about it is the problem is people don't see how big you can get naturally. The best way to solve it is just to show it. And that's what I do. There's other natties that will talk about the drawbacks, the downsides, the problems with PED use, and I'm all for that because you do need to understand those things before you make that decision, in my opinion. But I think another thing you have to do is just why do people go on gear? It's because they don't think you can get big naturally, so you have to prove that wrong. And the part of the problem with fitness social media is when they see a big natty, they're like, "Oh, he must be on gear," but it's like no, you have to kind of have a better understanding of your BS detector and your ability to tell who's natural and who's not.
Yeah, and like you said, a lot of people are taking gear just to look natty, so it throws off
Yeah.
the whole thing. Do you think you would do anything different if you were enhanced, or what do you think is different as far as the training, as far as natties versus enhanced?
Probably not. I mean, at a certain point, like at a certain kind of freak level of strength, I would imagine on PDs, you have to be a lot smarter with load management and intensity and volume, probably exercise selection too, because if you're moving super heavy weights, like, yeah, obviously getting a little bit more fatigue, but who knows because your ability to recover is obviously increased quite a bit. But then again, like can your joints and your tendons hang with that super heavy weight you're moving? Like that's why a lot of guys on PDs get injured at a much higher rate than natties. But other than that, I wouldn't say I know quite enough about enhanced lifting to make a decision on if I would change my training at all because I don't have experience with it firsthand. And I've never trained someone on gear either. It's all been natural lifters. So I don't think I have enough experience to even know what would change. Like it in a parallel universe, if I was on gear, I'm sure there would be differences in the approach that I take, though. Yeah, I just don't know what they would be. But
Yeah,
what about you? Well, like, did you change your training, or like, what have you noticed?
I was probably, I don't know, I don't think I changed it necessarily just because of I hopped on, but I definitely was more lower volume. I mean, I did it all though, you know. I think the more, like, I would say the only thing that changed as far as training, like you said, is probably recovery. So total volume is probably a little lower, and not
Mhm.
a lot different. I would say maybe diet's a little different just because you can process protein so much better, right? If you're on gear, you're able to
Yeah,
utilize so much more, and then you can actually store more of those carbs. So a lot of people kind of have it backwards. I think once you hop on gear, you got to eat like twice as much protein as you were. You probably benefit from more protein as a natty because you're not as efficient at converting that into actual muscle tissue and slightly lower ratio of carbs than someone who's got, super physical glycogen stores. So and that's not
right.
even that big. I would say that's probably really the only thing. And then probably like we talked about the recovery, just the volume, because like you said, as a natty, you're going to have those natural ebbs and flows of your hormones, and your recovery will be a little bit more nuanced based on that. Whereas, yeah, you might be burnt out a little bit, but you're not going to have the hormonal response as much if you're enhanced. So you can probably just push a little more. And then maybe I kind of like junk volume in the sense that I don't really think anything is junk volume. I don't think it takes away as much from like your top lifts as a lot of people worry about. But if I was natty, maybe I wouldn't do quite as much junk volume. But I do think there's some benefits because I think you're just driving blood and nutrients and where you want it. And I'm not a huge cardio guy, and that's just getting more movement in. So I'm not one of these guys who thinks you have to only have like one or two. Like I have one or two work sets, but I have two or three additional like kind of pump sets in there. A lot of times, depending on the movement, depending on where I'm at recovery wise and what exactly I'm focused on. But I do probably throw in more junk volume as enhanced than I would as a natty. But that's probably the only thing training wise.
Interesting. Yeah, that's it's not something I would do. I mean, I'm not like I'm not too worried about fatigue. A lot of people do talk about fatigue like it's what's holding you back from making gains. It's that junk volume. And I kind of agree with you where it's like junk volume isn't really the issue. Like if you can do 7 sets a week and that's the top of the bell curve, that's the most gains you can make. If you do 12 sets a week, it's probably not enough to hold you back. It might just be a little bit more than you really need. I'm fine with that. Like I don't really see an issue with that. If anything, it's like if you have the time and the energy to kind of play it safe and like go a little bit like overshoot a little bit, I think it makes sense. And it's like, yeah, it's technically junk volume. And it's like, but that's probably fine. There's also what I would call like baggage volume, which is one of the first videos I made. I probably did a terrible job explaining it, but I would call baggage volume something. It's like there's junk volume, which I see as just like it's not going to help you, it's not going to hurt you. It's just it is what it is. It's a waste of time at worst. It's a little bit beneficial at best. Um, then there's baggage volume where it's like that's the volume you get into that's like going to hold you down. Like that's baggage that you carry with you to your next session. And that's going to cause you to have to take deloads when you otherwise wouldn't have to, or at least have to as soon. Or it's going to make you have to lower your frequency. So you can't train as often and create as much of a stimulus that way. It might make it so you have to take time off due to injury or overuse or whatnot too. It could drain kind of like your mental energy and it might make you burned out a little bit more because obviously doing those crazy workouts where you're just like dreading subconsciously how much that's going to hold you back and how much it's going to suck to go through, and that can kind of decrease motivation a little bit too. And for all those reasons I would avoid. I mean that's the way I used to train in power building. I do like a bunch of working sets on squat, bench, deadlift because ironically at that time more volume meant more growth too. So it was kind of a lethal combination that led to some burnout, but a little bit of junk volume wouldn't hurt, I don't think. Especially another quick point here for beginners, sometimes doing a little bit more than they need to grow. lets them practice that movement more. And I think that's one thing that can be beneficial for them.
Definitely. There's a skill, not a lot of skill to bodybuilding, but there is definitely a skill at the big for beginners. And
Yeah.
if you master that and you get more time under tension on there, you're able to get a lot more out of your muscles than just, a lot of beginners I feel like push the weight way too soon. They try to
Mm.
progress by weight right away. Like I do progress by volume for my beginners just in the beginning, and after that, I usually don't progress by volume too much. Let's talk about your stretch video. So it was talking about the most misunderstood and overrated, right? Wasn't that what you're saying? The concept in the fitness industry, and I agree as well. So, what do you think kind of started this stretch obsession? Where does it mainly get perpetrated, and like what exercise would you think it applies to the most?
Yeah, good question. So the stretch started to get super popular. I want to say it was a few years ago, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. It started to kind of take over everything, and you kind of hear it all the time. And you get it confused with training at long lengths and stretch mediated hypertrophy. That's another one where people just think the stretch is this all-encompassing like hypertrophic property. And people were trying to understand that before they even understood like resistance profiles at a very basic kind of surface level. So you get people that try and go for like a deep stretch on lifts that do not even have a length and bias resistance profile. And what your muscle can handle isometrically in a stretch is far more than it can handle in a mid to short position in like a dynamic range of motion. So why would you risk losing your setup and losing your stability to get a stretch when you can't even use as much weight as that muscle can actually handle in a stretch? The weight you're using is, like I said, it's limited by how strong you are in a dynamic concentric on a shorter or length or shorter mid-range bias lift. So if you were to take like I see a lot of people do this with I used incline dumbbell bench as an example because that's not the worst case scenario. It's not the most extreme example of it, but it's one where it makes a little bit of sense to explain that. So instead of explaining that again, I'll go to a probably a more extreme example, I'd say, which would be like a dumbbell overhead press. So if you're doing a dumbbell overhead press, and obviously you understand the stuff, but just for like the viewer, the resistance profile, the weight of the dumbbell is going to stay the same the whole time, but the like strength curve of the lift is going to be due to your internal anatomy and how that moves throughout the rep. So let's say you start at the top, there's going to be very little tension on your delts. It's really just stabilizing it up top so the dumbbell doesn't fall over because the weight is going to be stacked on your wrist, over your elbow, directly over your shoulder. As you come down and the weight is kind of sitting in your wrist over your elbow, the weight's loaded at the elbow, your shoulder's here, and this is where it rotates right on your shoulder joint. The horizontal distance is the moment arm, which will measure basically how much the weight weighs, to put it simply, at various points of the range of motion. So right here, this is going to be peak tension. So when I see people try and go for a deep stretch, now as you come back down, your elbow starts to tuck in more and more. And now at the bottom, when you're in that supposed deep stretch, tension's basically all the way dropped off. So if you want to get a deep stretch on your shoulders, why are you trying to go for that on a lift where you're limited to how much you can press when you're right here? Just doesn't make a whole ton of sense to me. You're also not, it's not just redundant, in my opinion. I think you also lose a little bit of strength and you lose a little bit of your setup and stability when you go into that super deep position on various lifts that are kind of mid to short range bias. But that's just a quick example of like how the stretch isn't going to offer that much tension, which probably doesn't offer that much benefit either. And even if it like regardless of the stretch, people could say, well, it's still worth it to get a stretch. And I would say, well, you should still have a lift that offers a good stretch in your program anyways. So why are you trying to get the stretch on everything?
Yeah, that's the big thing. Like I think that is what blows my mind now. It's really crazy. These people that like follow Dr. Mike and these guys, they get so confident. They'll go just talk shit on some bodybuilder's page and they're doing maybe say they're doing a preacher curl and they're not going all the way down. And it's like they'll shit on them. Like you haven't seen anything else this person has done their entire workout. Like maybe they're just finishing and they're doing a short range on this. Maybe they did like a stretch cable curl. They're getting some length and tension on there. Like it's not every single move has to be there. You do get it at some point. And I don't
Yeah.
think that
They
people,
lack they lack the ability to view the bigger picture. It's they take little things out of context. But yeah, sorry to interrupt. Go on.
no, and it's just great. And like, one thing I really hate, I hate that. I hate that I have to agree with any points that Paul Carter makes because I know he's big on this. This is probably one of the only things that I agree with him on. And it's like the people that even promote it though, they're not even like bodies that you really are like shooting to achieve and shooting to get yourself. So it just kind of blows my mind that that has been so dominant now when it was the opposite when I first went to the gyms. You know, there's been a big pendulum shift and everyone loves a good full range. It's like I want as deep of a range as I can, but I want to keep tension where I want it. And then there might be some times where I do want to disperse a little tension to other areas, and maybe I'll get in a little extra extension. I'll go a little deeper, but that's not going to be like my primary driver of hypertrophy for sure. And people can feel it too. Like when people like think they're getting a big stretch, like a lot of times they don't feel what they're supposed to stretch. And they say, "Oh, well, you're not supposed to even think about my muscle. So and so says that's not important." It's like, oh man, that's another thing that I think people really kind of shit on bodybuilders about is like talking about mind muscle. It's like you can't base everything off of that, but that's a tool that you're going to use pretty efficiently if you know how to use it. And you can definitely tell where you're putting tension and where you're not. Whenever someone just completely writes off mind muscle, I don't think that's a good move. What's your opinion on that? Because I know that that one's kind of varied in the natty world.
Yeah, so I get asked a lot about that from like the people I train. They're like, "Oh, is mind muscle connection important?" Usually the answer that I'll give is it's correlated, but ultimately technique, execution, setup is what matters most. Mind muscle connection comes into play when you have the setup right, but maybe your technique or your execution isn't right. That can give you some feedback. What I would also say is a lot of people don't necessarily understand mind muscle connection. They think it's like a like a contraction sensation, and they're like, well, I'm going heavier on curls now. I can't feel the squeeze as much at the top. I'm like, yeah, that's just how it's going to be because your other elbow flexors are now contributing since you're not limiting to what you can only feel in your biceps. But usually what I leave it at is it's going to be correlated in most cases, but it doesn't have to be there. So if you don't feel something the most you possibly can, it's okay. If your technique is fine and it looks all right, like you're good. In most cases, of course, there are going to be some unique circumstances where maybe you have someone that recruits a different muscle at a different part of the range of motion for whatever reason, they start to lose sensation there. That could be quite useful in that case. But yeah, overall, I'd say it's yeah useful and highly not highly, but it is going to be correlated with good technique, but it's not entirely required, especially like getting that super peak contraction thing, like a lot of people think mind muscle connection is. I would say mind muscle connection is just your overall ability to feel that that target muscle is working. It doesn't have to be an intense burn or pain. I'd say you just have to be able to feel like when you're doing a row and you're trying to train your mid to low traps, can you feel your traps squeezing together? Can you feel that they're moving in and out regardless of the intensity of that sensation?
And this is something I probably carry over from the clinic a little bit, is because a lot of the repositioning and stuff we'll do when we're trying to get your axial skeleton in a little bit better position, we need like super specific stuff to fire. We're like, okay, I got to have that anterior glute mid fire. You can't have your TFL with that, can't have anything else. And it's like, that'll cause reposition. And it's like, okay, if you can be that specific, they can connect to there. There's going to be some benefits to connecting as far as at least hypertrophy if you feel it, if you're in the right setup, because you can trick yourself. You can do things to make you feel like you're getting more of a contraction than you're not. So it is tricky. But like I said, if your setup's good, I think you should definitely be able to feel it, unless it's like you said, getting close to failure, getting the heavy or in range contraction. Sometimes, you know, you're gonna have other things help a little bit. But I think that as a beginner, I think they should definitely try to feel what's happening when they're going and feel like we were talking about not progressing by weight. Like a lot of times I'll have a beginner just keep the same weight a little bit longer. And I just like, okay, I just want you to feel like you connect to this more. Do you feel
Yeah.
more in the actual muscle as you're going? But then again, as you become more advanced, not as much of as a cue. Is there
Yeah.
is there
I think
anything
it's
that go
no,
ahead?
I just real quick. I was gonna say I think it's lift dependent too, and I'd even say it's pretty individual. Like just in like a practical sense, when I'm working with like a beginner, you get some people that are like on one end of the extreme where they're like hyper focused on the numbers, and anytime they don't hit a PR, they're like, oh no, the sky is falling, I'm plateaued, my muscles are shrinking. Those people, they need to be told try and focus on the muscle a little bit more. Like, yeah, you can use more weight, but if you have to arch more or bounce the bar off your chest, speed up your eccentric, widen your grip, etc., use more leg drive, butt comes up. Like there's all those little things that help you a ton, and it obviously is at the expense of that muscle work, and that's why you can use more weight. And then you get people on the other side of the extreme where they're like they almost use mind muscle connection as like an excuse to not go heavier on any of their lifts, where
Yeah.
they're well, I don't feel this muscle as much if I start to lift heavier. If I go too forcefully on my presses, I start to lose that connection with my pecs. But it's like, well, if this is a lift that is, you don't have to focus on your technique with, so say like a machine chest press or something where it's like as long as you have like kind of your ribs and your scaps packed into the right position, like your technique's pretty much fine. And from there, it's like, regardless of what you feel, as long as your technique is good, then you're fine. Like I would feel my pecs more if I used 50% of my working weight and just focused on contracting my pecs. It would be much harder to get to failure at that point to activate every muscle fiber because I'm training so maximally. But if I was to use like exactly what my working weight should be, I'll feel that my chest is contracting and lengthening, but I won't feel that sensation quite as much, at least in a good amount of lifts. And I think that holds a lot of beginners back too, where they have to kind of accept that you might not feel it the most, as in like the highest amount of sensation. And that's okay. You can still kind of progress from there. But it should always be, the answer really is just kind of in the middle, in my opinion.
And the move that's always blamed about this, right, is that lat pull, right, where everyone goes super slow controlled and feel that lat, and it's like you could use a little more weight, bro. You don't have to even hit the 4 inch every single time. But I think that's the one that people usually go way too light on.
Yeah.
Are there so in addition to like the stretch obsession, are there any like concepts that you think are a little overrated as far as like the evidence-based community or natties go?
Oh, overrated. I would say,
And maybe not like bad at all, but maybe just too
yeah,
much of an emphasis placed on.
overhyped a little bit. I would say, I think free weights are probably the most overrated. People for whatever reason, and it's gotten a lot better in recent years, but it's like kind of for the most part, like stability is your friend for hypertrophy training. So using machines is usually going to be the best way to go if you want to maximize hypertrophy. There's a lot of strange misconceptions I see that you can't train hard on machines, or you have to like learn how to suffer under a barbell before you hop onto a machine. It's like I kind of get where that person's coming from, but the fact that someone can't trade hard on a machine is that's it's very subjective, and it's a little bit of a straw man. Like it just doesn't make sense. Like your muscle's a muscle. How hard you push it is up to what's in here. It's not really up to whether that machine or barbell is stable or not, or classified as a machine or barbell. So I would say just using free weights is probably overrated as a concept overall as far as hypertrophy goes. I would say I do think leg training is overrated too. There's a guy on YouTube. He doesn't post quite as much anymore, but his name's Abel. His channel's SSD Abel, and he has a great channel. He's very level-headed, very good at kind of encapsulating the bigger picture. He reminds me like personality type wise of someone like GVS, and I can't remember exactly how he worded it, but I was on a podcast with him on his channel, and he was like, I used to train legs super hard and prioritize them because it was seen as like the more noble thing to do, not because I cared to have big legs. And I was like, that's a very good way to say it. And he articulated that probably much better than I just did. But I was like, that's very true because there's something that you like. You train legs because you want to be respected, maybe not because you care about having big legs. Like I think if you were to polygraph everyone that had jacked legs, it's like, do you really did you really care to have huge legs? Or are they like kind of cool? Not really, but I suffered too much for what I have. And I probably should have put that effort elsewhere, but not going to complain because I got big legs and I got that respect now. So I'd say leg training overall, I would say is a little bit overrated as far as like aesthetics goes and my personal preferences. I really like the silver era physiques. And I think for natties, it's like, obviously you're somewhat limited in terms of potential. So I think proportionally letting your upper body stay a little bit bigger, I just think it looks better even on stage. And obviously in a kind of like an off-season relaxed state in 12 to 20% body fat. And other than that, as far as like actual training concepts, I would say, yeah, I mean there's a lot, I guess. I can't really think of anything off the top of my head though. Like I think st I would say stability is underrated. Kind of already talked about that with the machines. Progressive overload, ironically, I do think it's a little bit overrated or maybe overblown to where it's like people act like it's so important that nothing else that goes into it matters. And I know those are very like broad generalizations, and I could talk about that stuff for hours, but what do you think though?
Well, yeah, with the like the logbook and progressive overload, I mean, that's true. That's, I don't know if you saw where you know, I was doing some work with Sergio Oliva Jr. and he's sponsored by Jordan Peters. You follow any of these guys? You follow the pros at all?
I don't follow the pros. I know a decent amount about Jordan Peters though.
Yeah, so he was doing, you know, he's huge on the logbook, right? That's his thing.
Yeah.
He's married to that logbook, and he had made a post where he was just showing his training. And I wouldn't have said anything if I wasn't already training as an athlete, but I, you know, made a little comment. I was like, bro, you've destroyed the logbook. There's no more room to go. And just the technique he was using was just so much compressive force coming from the rib cage and like not tension on there. And then he wrote me a little private message like, dude, thank you so much for I don't ever get constructive criticism I can use. And then he shouted me out on his next post and like changed things up and switched to single arm. And I got like 300
Wow.
followers from him because he's so respected, you know. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, he
that's
is.
it's so easy to make subtle changes that you're not even aware of to get that extra 2 to 5 pounds, and you're gonna have no clue you did it, and you're gonna feel like, okay, I got more weight, I progressed. Well, you could have took weight off what you were trying to do. You could have technically done less weight, but you got more axial skeleton load, more on your connective tissue, more on whatever else you got involved. So obviously, progressive overload, you want to like, get stronger, but I think having a logbook and trying to hit it every single time is kind of silly for most people because they're not aware enough of what's happening, you know, to make sure that it's progressing from where they want as they get to that intermediate to more advanced levels. And then obviously, as we talked about, I think the stretch is super overrated in the sense that like people will not even do a short range; they'll just do only length and partials for their entire program.
Yeah.
Maybe with the new study, maybe they'll stop that. You know, these guys base everything they do off of whatever fucking random new study has come out this week.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say, okay, so yeah, for the logbook thing, yeah, what one quick kind of like side note, I guess we'll use Jordan Peters as the example because he's the one we're talking about, but you get some people that are like so respected, whether it's deserved or not. Jordan Peters, I think he's great. I think he should be respected as he is. But then it's like just because people are so in awe and have this much respect for him that he never gets criticized, and that can be a problem too if that person one starts out really great but then comes up with bad ideas can be a little bit dangerous. And even like a little mini example of you calling like saying, hey, well, yeah, I mean, progressive overload is obviously very important, but what about this? And then he thanked you because nobody probably says that to him because they look to him as this god. But if we're going to talk about like specifically the whole logbook thing, it incentivizes you to cheat. It's like sometimes people absolutely do need that push. But when you give that advice to someone like me, I took that and ran with it. So when I, as obviously a natural lifter, like I have no room for error in my training. I have to make sure I'm properly stimulating my muscle for it to grow. Like, I'm sorry, I can't just do anything and get at least growth from whatever cycle I'm on. So when you take the advice of get your deadlift up, get a huge deadlift, and you will be jacked. I switched to sumo, and then I started bouncing the weights off the floor, and then I started using a deadlift bar that bent, the Ohio Rogue bar. And then I switched to using a couple bumper plates to kind of push the weights out a little bit further. And then instead of straps, I used a mixed grip and lowered the bar to my fingertips. And it's like, before you knew it, I'm doing speed work, banded deadlifts, sumo stance. And I'm like, what am I doing? Like I can deadlift over 600, but my arms are 16 inches. Like what has gone wrong here? And that advice taken to the extreme, it incentivizes you to do all these little tricks just to hit that PR. And it sets that like internal psychological reward that we get for accomplishing tasks or making progress so tied to that logbook. And the logbook is paper. It's not film, it's not video. You're not looking at yourself in practice in the gym. So it separates the two. And all of a sudden, what you do in the gym and how you move that weight doesn't matter within some type of reason. But of course, if you are like, should I do one solid set or should I do the same exact performance with really good technique that I did last week? Or should I cheat a little bit more just to get that extra PR? And as humans, it's like when we are chasing that little reward from each session, you're taking that PR, and then sure enough, you corner yourself. Those keep piling up, and before you know it, you've shifted from bodybuilder over to the extreme of like power lifter. And I'm not saying you even have to do squat, bench, deadlift, although you are going to be drawn to those because you can see progression the most frequently on those lifts just due to their loading potential. But you can even turn that into like, all right, well, let's take that powerlifting type approach to my other lifts. If I practice 1 rep maxes on X bicep lift, will the 1 rep max get you better growth? No, but will it get your rep work a little bit higher on curls? Probably a little bit. Will it get you a little to move a little bit more efficiently? Probably a little bit. And it's like that's how your technique kind of goes to shit. That's how your numbers go up, and you're kind of left with a mediocre physique when you're as strong as anyone else on paper and you're super fatigued and burnt out.
And some people get kind of like messed up psychologically. Like I've heard Jordan talk about how if he didn't hit what he was supposed to hit, he was fucked for the next week until that session came back around. He was like in a little bit of a dark place because he failed. And I'm like,
Yeah.
very rarely does anything in life just go like linearly, right? Like it's okay. Like maybe you got less sleep, maybe you had something going on, maybe you slept weird, your exoskeleton's a little off, and you're not setting as good as a pulling position. Like it's all right. Like as long as you progress over time. So I do think some people like just mentally for that reason should not have it at all if they're that type of personality.
Oh, numbers oriented people. And a lot of guys are like that. Like as men, we're just built like that. Like we all love fantasy sports, looking at stats for sports, looking at like our bank accounts. Like we love measuring things. We love numbers. So when you get that in a guy's head, it's like they just get too obsessed with it. And then yeah, their mental health depends on that. So if your mental sanity depends on you hitting a PR, do you think you're going to be able to just be like, "Oh, I'll sacrifice the PR and just keep my technique solid?" Or do you think they're going to chase that PR at any expense? Yeah, they're going to go for the PR, obviously. Uh, I've made quite a few videos at this point on the concept of progressive overload anxiety, where I talk about that exact thing, and that's really what my channel is based on, is progressive overload anxiety and how that like completely changed my training. I mean, another little concept here. I don't know if you can relate to it or not, if you've kind of gone through a similar thing. It's where I would the first thing I did was I would call any lift that wasn't squat, bench, deadlift, I would call it an accessory lift. So that way, subconsciously, I would view it as less important. So I would tell myself progressive overload doesn't matter on this because it's an accessory, which means it is something that only complements the bigger picture here, which would be in this case the big three. And then all of a sudden, what happened? I said, all right, well, these lifts don't matter because they're accessories. They're lighter lifts, so I'm going to see less progress less frequently anyways. So what's the point? How could I grow my arms when progressive overload is what drives growth and you can barely ever PR on curls and your strength is capped super low? If I want to get big arms, I have to keep progressing on my deadlifts and pull-ups because you can progress more often on those and they somewhat involve the elbow flexors. And it's like you kind of have this flawed logic that starts to kick into your brain. It's like all these little weird mind like tricks that your brain plays on you just so you can like scratch that itch of like being able to check off a +1 or +5 pounds to your program. And it's such a strange thing to balance. And it's I think it's so nuanced, but nobody gives it the light of day.
Oh yeah. I personally for myself, not even every workout, but I would say right now I'm on a 6 day split. I would say like four out of those 6 days, maybe five out of six. I have one, maybe two, but usually just one exercise that I'll track, but it's just in my head. I'm not like writing it down or anything. And that's what I want to like push my strength on for wherever I want to hit. And then for me, when you're aware, you have a lot more like room. You know that you're not going to overdo it. You have a lot more room for error because it's like for me, like my whole thing over the last like 2 or 3 years is I had some like back pain, neck pain, like elbows, wrists, nothing like that was ever bad, but just like shit that was always constant and like little bit. Every 3 to 4 months, someone would take me out for like 5 days, and so I just really, as I started diving into the more of the PT and the PRI and Bill Hartman world, I got a lot more aware of just different things. And so what I kind of do now is when I'm trying to push for failure, try to progress the logbook, it's like I'll go to the point where I'm losing that relative motion, depending on whatever the exercise is. And so it's like failure looks different for everybody, right? So it's like some people fail when they can't move anything from point A to point B and their whole body's convulsing, but their total shape has changed. Now it looks wonky, right? Or
Yeah.
some people's failure mentally, they fell way before they're actually failing. For
Yeah.
me, I tend to stop like when I start to feel my body wanting to compensate in a way that I'm trying to avoid right now. Not necessarily in a way that would cause like harm or anything, but like say I'm doing squats, like if I'm maxing out on like Smith squats or something, I'm really focusing on like keeping that pressure on the inner part of my feet, those two contact points of the inner heel and that first metatarsal head. And then as soon as I just can't do that, and like I feel like my feet want to flare to this side, my knees want to bow out, I can't like get that pressure where I want it, then that's my failure. So I'm just
Yeah.
pushing my logbook until I start to compensate with more orientation patterns. Like with a bench, it would just be to the point where I start to get a little extension that I don't really want. And so that's my failure. I could do maybe 2 more reps with that, but it wouldn't be ideal for me. It'd be a little bit wonky. And actually, and it's interesting because as I've done this over the last couple of years, I got to the point where are you familiar with like kind of the concept of relative motion and orientation? I mean, it's basically like a butt wink would be an orientation, like someone who's walking and they look like a corgi when they walk. That's a lot of orientation. Relative motion is things moving interdependently of each other, right? Like when we're pressing, if we press and we have relative like rib orientation instead of immediately flaring out. So I've been really trying to limit my orientation. And when I first started it, it was like I would get close to failure and then I could still orient and get like a couple more. And it wouldn't, and I'm not talking about big orientation, just a little bit. Now I've been
Yeah.
able to like drive my body to the point where when I'm at failure using mainly relative motion, I can't even cheat one more out. So now I'm like really at real failure. And it's a little bit lighter weight, but that's kind of how I approach things now when I'm doing a logbook. I'm always going to stop right before I start getting my axial skeleton a little wonky. And then, maybe, like I said, maybe I'll do something lighter where maybe I'll do like a light guillotine press or something, but that's not gonna be like my main driver for hypertrophy. I'm definitely not gonna logbook that.
Yeah, I think it helps the standardization too. It also helps just kind of keep your ego in check if you are even if you're advanced, but I'd say even for like those kind of beginner intermediates that they feel the pressure of like I need to hit progressive overload this session because I'm going to go on Instagram or YouTube and someone's going to shove progressive overload down my throat 24/7. It's a good way to focus on it because you can say like for you where you have obviously a very good understanding of it and you have more attention to detail, you notice it on your presses. Most people wouldn't notice that. You can take an easier example of something that is still a compound lift but a little bit less stable, so maybe something like a pull down or a pull up. And it's like if you want to focus on just say like scapular depression and retraction, and you want to focus on adduction of the humerus, and you want to just kind of train overall your lats, you want to train your mid to low traps as well, rhomboid area, you can focus on that. But as soon as you start to track your elbows forward, you start to kind of round your back like this, it's clearly a little bit of a change of what muscles are being recruited. Maybe your elbow flexors starting to take over a little
Or
bit more,
that'll
kind
come
of trying
up
to
too.
arch up and around
Yeah.
with the traps. It's like a lot of earlier lifters will say on paper that still counts, but you're just training other muscles entirely. And then before you know it, it's like they're so focused on progressive overload that before they know it, they keep trying to add weight and reps, and they can because they keep kind of cheating the form. Before you know it, their entire set is like this with kind of like a rounded back. You're not really training the muscles that you want to anymore. So I would say it's like it is really good to kind of have that idea of when technique breakdown is, or as you like to say, when you start to see a little bit of that orientation. Which I'm not
The,
familiar with that term, but I have heard you say it a few times, so that kind of makes more sense now that you say it. So orientation is just kind of like a certain part of your body deviating from your ideal setup.
Yeah, like you might see someone doing a lunge and say they're doing just a split squat and they just look funky. They have like one hip that's hiked up a little bit, the knees kind of pointing out a little weird. The
Mm.
hips and the pelvis, they're not moving with the foot and the tibia. And what I noticed most is like you do get a lot more mind muscle and I get fucking sore every goddamn workout for the last 2.5 years. I'm sore with whatever I hit, mainly quads and pecs. I mean, my pecs, I could do like 2 to 3 sets and they just kill me the next day. Like I feel so bad for
Mm.
people that can't connect to those muscles. And then there are some muscles that do benefit from orientation patterns. Like you can build a lot more ass and traps and low back and potentially you can leverage yourself to orient a way to get some pretty good triceps and biceps, things that aren't like directly attached to the rib cage. You have a little more options with kind of playing around, but it
Right.
definitely does keep target attention more, and I get way more sore doing that. And I'm way weaker. I mean, my weights are quite a bit down, probably like
Yeah.
20 to 30% across the board compared to where I used to be. And I wasn't a sloppy lifter before. I was still pretty tight, but now that I'm really focused on it, it definitely makes me a little weaker. Um, Now we talked about kind of things that the evidence-based crowd kind of overrates. Is there anything that you think that they underrate? Is there any like bro science stuff that you do or anything that you do in your training that isn't a lot of evidence for necessarily?
I like that question because that is it's kind of impossible to talk about anecdote and bro science these days. I still talk about it a lot, but I put a lot of reasoning and thought behind it. So I try and explain things the best that I can without just saying and sounding like a bro. But I would say underrated. Nothing I can think of off the top of my head. I mean, it's like I feel like at this point I'm almost so like I don't want to say I live under a rock, but it's like I really just focus on exactly what I do. I don't watch a whole ton of content anymore outside of like a handful of channels. So I'm not entirely sure what is being underrated or overrated like in the bigger picture right now. As concepts, like I couldn't pinpoint anything that I would say is underrated. I mean, I would say arm training as a whole has always been underrated. And as far as like more specific to bodybuilding, I'd probably keep it to arm training. Um, they kind of get written off because they're single joint exercises, or at least like even if you take a JM, which is a compound lift, it's still the primary mover on that's going to be your triceps. But I wouldn't say there's any concept really that I can specifically name that's clearly underrated, like in my opinion. I would say as far as lifts go, I still think the JM press and its variations are underrated. I think cable overhead extensions are a tiny bit overrated for
Like for
some people because
triceps?
yeah, because they
Mm.
lack stability. I think what the cable setup is fine and everything, but I think what needs to be done in a lot of cases is give back support. So have like a utility bench where you can brace your back up against it. Then the weight can pull your arms up overhead and it can kind of stretch your triceps up without you being limited by how much you can manually push your arm overhead. So it's like if you ever train like honestly most lifters, like pretty much anyone that isn't doing that lift to like the technique that I would aim for, if they do it like without the back support, if they do it say standing or straddling a bench or standing with a cable or something, the elbows almost always come down significantly and they almost always flare out. Where if you can use the back support, you can almost lean into it and let the weight in your hands pull your elbows up way overhead. Other than that, I wouldn't necessarily say there's anything that's too underrated, like as far as lifts go. I mean, I feel like I'm almost out of touch with like the mainstream right now
You're
because
just
I'm in
just in
my
your
own little
basement.
yeah. I just focus on JM presses and preacher curls. I don't really care what anyone else says these
You're
days.
you're out there in your basement up in Maine. You're disconnected.
Yeah, no, quite literally.
You
What
know
would
that
you
that
what would
what
you say is
that tricep
underrated?
move you're talking about, the Panada and Atlantis both have machines for that, and those that's my favorite fucking tricep move there is. I love that with the
Dude, I
back
wish I
support.
wish those were more common. I
Yeah,
so do.
they're not at many commercial gyms. You got to go to some pretty nicer ones for that. I would say like something that I think that gets completely written off, like people just like laugh at me when I talk about it is, and again, I think that this comes down to a lot of people just writing off things that bodybuilders say because they're juiced, they're big. But when you have like people like Phil Heath, like if you look at him, his best body part was his back, and it was probably his shittiest body part when he turned pro. And he talks a lot about what he did for that. And, it wasn't crazy hard progressive overload. It wasn't like anything crazy intense. It was really focusing on getting like a good contraction. And I feel like the natties and the evidence-based crew are like, they really don't give a shit about contraction, about squeeze, about in-range tension. And no, it's not the main driver, but he credits it to really helping him with his details. And you hear guys like Milos talk about, the leg extensions really helping bring out the details in the quads, and Chris Cormier and all these pros talking about that's really helped them get to their striations and get the details. And what I changed the most about my back training was taking out the extension. And I've been doing a lot of pauses and the squeezes, and my back has become kind of nutty. And it was kind of really shit for a while. And like it looks way different than everyone else on stage. And I think that's probably because I do a little bit different. But I do think that like getting a real good squeeze, a good in-range contraction is underrated. Is it as important as getting a load on the stretch length for hypertrophy? No, not at all. But I do think that people shouldn't write it off, especially do like completely length and partials only. When you're doing like me and Atlas talked about, like I do some length and work for my delts, but I definitely do probably more short and focus work on that. I don't think like every muscle necessarily needs as much length and focus. I do, 1.5s from the sides right there. And I just think that people should probably not write those off all the way. Don't make them the focus of your training necessarily, but I definitely think there's some benefits. Maybe it helps with some details. Maybe it helps somehow like, get the fascia to loosen. I don't know, but I think that writing it off completely is a mistake just because there's so much like evidence that's not like proven. It's hard. How are you going to prove this? You know what I mean? You're going to be able to sit there and say this muscle looks a little bit better aesthetically. Like you're not going to be able to
Yeah,
get
yeah,
a
yeah.
study that shows that. So I don't know. What are
Yeah.
your thoughts on in-range contraction actually getting a little bit of a squeeze?
So I think it's useful. It's not something I say is entirely mandatory, but I think you raise a really good point with it's like when we're talking about evidence based, you have to think of the incentives of that evidence based community. For them, it's they need to have a shiny new toy. And that shiny new toy oftentimes makes not just the new toy shiny, it makes the old toy kind of dull and it makes that seem a little bit less appealing. And that's the whole problem with like trends and fads in the fitness industry. We've been in it for a while where things come and go and things get flip-flopped quite a bit. It's 5 years ago, 50 sets a week was the norm. People do 30, 40, 50 sets a week. And now low volume in 2022 and 2023 became the norm. So it's like you can brainwash yourself and get brainwashed super easily. And as humans, we can be convinced super, super easily. So I think you just have to be careful with how much you fall for new trends and new fads. And you have to really think about if they're useful or not, and if this is conclusive. Because a lot of the times you can prove like a specific point is real. Like you can prove that, all right, well, long length partials do build a good amount of muscle, but there could be something that you don't, that nobody's brought up yet, or something that these people just aren't aware of that could be equally as important, more important, or anything in between. And it's never a good idea to write stuff off entirely because if you've been in the industry for more than 3, 4, 5, 6 years, like stuff comes and goes. So I've never been able to write something off. I would also say to get a little bit more specific to your question, if you're talking about back training, I do actually advocate for shortened, sometimes more like short focused work and not necessarily having a short biased resistance profile. But if you look at like the back as a whole, your back isn't your biceps, your back isn't your side delts. It's your back. It's a bunch of different muscle groups. So when you take something like, say, a row, if you were to do like a lengthened partial row and say that's like all you're going to do for your traps, how much are your traps really doing in the bottom half of a row? Like, how much do your scaps actually have to move? Or is it just your humerus kind of contracting? It's really just your lats doing all the work with a tiny bit of rear delts and elbow flexors. Like, is that a good idea logically? Like, on paper, if longer lengths overall give more hypertrophy, cool. But what about neuromechanical matching? Like, that's a concept that basically for anyone listening, I'm no expert on this whatsoever. I just know a little bit about it. Your muscle, your body, your brain recruits the muscle that has the best leverage at various points of the range of motion, regardless of what you choose or don't choose. So if your traps have very good leverage at the top, at that contraction of the row, then yeah, that's going to be where they grow best, regardless of whether it's short or at a longer length. So I think that's something you have to kind of look into. And I found that personally for my rear delt training, I've always found that my rear delts grow a little bit better in a shorter position. So I'll actually do short partials on reverse pec deck because as soon as I go into that longer length, I actually feel my traps and my scaps get more range of motion that I need to actually feel a decent contraction and not just like sensationally, but like actually feel my rear delt go through a big range of motion, even though it's just kind of in that shortened half of a full 90-degree range of motion on the machine.
Yeah, and some people get leveraged in a way because their axial skeleton's so fucked up that it's like they are really leveraged towards getting certain parts of the trap to recruit, and it's hard for them to get the stuff that they need. And a lot of that is because they try to hit a huge, crazy range of motion. They're already all funky, out of whack. Um, excuse me. So, do you do anything as far as like focusing on the shortened range on your own? You said you do the rear delt.
Yeah, I'd say rear delts, and I go for a big range of motion on my chest supported T-bar rows when I do them. In T-bar rows in general, I try and get a huge contraction because I'm just a believer that it's like people talk about length and partial on rows, but like in this bottom half, like I can tell that my traps really aren't doing much at all. So I just don't care that much about it. And that's why I pick a T-bar row because it gets a little bit lighter at the point, so you can get a little bit more range of motion and actually challenge your traps more at that bottom when they're probably doing less anyways. So it just kind of matches the strength curve a little bit better too. So when I do those, it's like you'll see if I posted a video as the ultimate guide to rowing, and my technique for T-bar rows is I go all the way down. I get a good stretch because it's not going to hurt me at that point. Totally fine. It's a stable lift. It makes sense to try and get a deep stretch there. as I come up, I don't just stop at like elbows kind of by the rib cage like I would for lats. I go up and all the way back and squeeze everything kind of back and in. And my traps are lit up. They're super sore right now. I have a video coming out. I have no idea when this will be released. I think it's the October 16th today or something. I'll be releasing that video likely tomorrow or the next day. And
Cool.
one of the lifts I did in that session at the commercial gym was a T-bar row with a super like big squeeze on T-bar rows. And that's an example where it makes sense. Other than that, I don't do a whole ton of short focused range of motion. Lats, I train, I wouldn't say length and partials, but I get less range of motion than most. I still get at least two peak resistance, usually a little bit beyond, but I usually like if I was to do a pull down or pull up, you won't see me going all the way here because I'm super weak in that position. It just kind of, I just really have no need to do it because I'm limited by that. But just going for like the bottom 75% has worked pretty well for me for lat training specifically.
Yeah, this will probably come out like maybe 4 days. So your video will be out, so check that out. And then, by the way, my next one is actually going to be on relative motion and orientation, how it applies in bodybuilding. So maybe that'll
Sweet.
be
Yeah, that'll be cool. I'll
interesting.
check it out. Yeah.
Yeah. And also for so that was a chest supported T-bar you were doing that one on?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's another one that I do. So I guess for me, it is back and like side delts and rear delts where I do a little more short and focused. Like I said, I'll do the 1.5s. I also do the 1.5s from the preacher too, and that's short and range. Sometimes like
Hmm.
a little extra from there.
Yep.
Someone had talked about you being pretty knowledgeable about resistance paths. Is that something you think about for every exercise, or what started you thinking about that, and how do you apply that?
Yeah, pretty much. I wouldn't say I'm super knowledgeable about it. It's one of those things where it's like I'm smart enough with that to realize that I don't know everything, but being smart enough to understand that means that I know more than most people. It's also something I talk about a lot more than other people. I think that's an underrated concept as a whole. If I wanted to give you on resistance profiles, because nobody teaches that stuff to you. Most of it is just self-taught because it really is just kind of straightforward, just physics. I do take it into account for pretty much every lift, so that way I'm not getting super redundant work in. And I do think it's pretty important to try and train muscles where they have the best leverage and generally try and train them at longer lengths if it makes sense. And I also find that if you get the resistance profile to match your internal strength curve, that makes a lot of sense too. So I know a lot of people that are probably watching this would be like, well, what's the point of just saying that if you're not going to explain it? And I know that would drive me crazy if I was in their shoes. So I've always tried to be the person that actually explains the why, not just the what. So an example of this would be to give you for anyone that doesn't understand what a resistance profile is, it is how far the weight moves horizontally from the axis that the weight's rotating on at various points in the lift. The farther that the weight is from the axis horizontally is going to determine the resistance profile of the lift. So if you are doing, say, a, a barbell curl at the bottom, since you're hinging at the elbow, the weight's right beneath your elbow. So there's going to be very little tension since horizontally there's no distance. It's only vertical distance. As you curl and you look at that horizontal distance here, it slowly increases to where when you're at a 90-degree arm bend, this is going to be peak tension because it's farthest horizontally. So it's the greatest moment arm. And you can really just feel that in a curl. Just you don't even have to understand the concept. You can just tell from going through the lift. And then you can apply that same concept to any other isolation lift. If you're going to turn that into a compound lift, say you're doing a row, say you're doing a bent over barbell row, pretend I'm bent over right now. If you were to do that row, when you start off, you're hinging at the elbow, you're also hinging at the shoulder. So if the weight's loaded beneath your shoulder, beneath your elbow, and then into your hand, as you row, the weight stays stacked under your elbow. So your wrist in the weight that you're holding in your hand is going to be right under your elbow. So now, since you're hinging at the shoulder, how far the load is, which is to put it simply, your elbow in this case is where it's loaded initially, not initially, but secondarily from, that starts to increase the horizontal distance if I'm bent over between my shoulder and my elbow. So it's really easy at the bottom and it gets super hard as you row. So if you're to do like a strict barbell or cable row, you'll find that if you don't cheat, if you go nice and strict, it gets super hard as you get to the lockout and you'll feel like it's extremely easy here and very hard here. So if you take those kind of two concepts and you say, let's do a chest supported T-bar row, the T-bar row, pretend the weight's loaded at my fingers and then it's hinging on my elbow here. as that weight comes up, as you pull it up from here, it slowly decreases that horizontal distance from the axis to the load from here. So as you pull and as the row would get harder, so as your internal strength curve would increase that moment arm, as you pull, this moment arm of the actual weight decreases. So the lift is designed to match your internal strength curve. So that's why T-bar rows feel super like natural and they feel kind of like comfortable and normal in a good way. And I think that's why so many bodybuilders of the past love this lift. And that's why so many like regular gym bros love this lift. They have no idea why they like it or why it works, but that's kind of the reasoning behind why I think it does work. And I think that's important to take into account because if you were to just do super strict barbell rows, you're probably not going to max out your back training because you're just limited by how strong you are at that peak contraction. And that's why so many bodybuilders love cheat rows. They can't explain why they like cheat rows because they don't understand resistance profiles and strength curves. But any top bodybuilder, they're obsessed with cheat rows. They're obsessed with T-bar rows. They have no idea why because they don't cheat on the presses. They don't cheat on their curls, but they always cheat on their rows. And that's kind of why.
Do you do anything to like alter it at all ever on any movements? Do you do like any
Um,
accommodating resistance or anything? Or
Accommodating resistance, I don't do because I really just I like length and bias lifts for the most part. Pretty much any lift out there, aside from presses and most like squat patterns, are going to be short biased anyways. So usually it's not as necessary. And even if you even if you turn that like that muscle group you're trying to target into an isolation lift, I think that kind of does the trick in a much more efficient way. So if you're to take like chest, for example, you train your chest through presses primarily, at least most people do. That's a length and bias lift. If you want a short biased lift, you can just do something with a flat resistance profile. That's an isolation lift. So something like a pec deck, where as an isolation lift, it's going to be hardest in the contraction because you're weaker in the contraction. So when you fail pec deck, you don't just go easy, easy. Oh, I can't move the weight at all. You go, all right, this is at failure. Like I've been able to tap my hands every time, and now I'm here and I can't get it because I failed in the short position. So even though the resistance profile doesn't actually change, your pecs are just going to be weaker in that peak contraction. So that's usually like what I would do instead of like adding bands or chains to a press to try and train that short position. Um, Same goes for like squat patterns. So if you're doing leg press or hacks that are like mid to length and biased and you don't get a good contraction, a leg extension does the same thing. You would never fail at the bottom of a leg extension. You fail just before the top, and then you get a little bit less, a little bit less. So that's one thing I take into account. But uh, yeah, I usually wouldn't use accommodating resistance, although I'm not entirely against it. I just think it's a little less convenient.
something I do a lot, and I don't know if people do this. So like I said, I'm not that tuned in either. So I'll do like you said, like the shortened bias, like leg extension, and then I'll superset that with a lengthened bias, reverse Nordic or something like that. I like to really
Yeah.
overload it that way. And then I love, I don't have them at my gym now, but at my old gym I had all the prime, and I work out where they got some of the strive stuff. You can kind of play with the lengthened bias and stuff on there. That's pretty cool to mess around with. But I don't know if it really does all that much besides extending the sets, which I think is cool. You're able to like extend a little bit more if you change the resistance profile a little bit.
Mm.
Excuse me. So I had a couple questions that people were asking. Let me see if I have anything over here before I let you go, big guy. Um, we kind of already talked about that. Who has the best physique out of all the natty influencers? Do you think
Ooh,
GVS and then Alex will seem to be the two that I hear a lot. I throw you up there too. You have a very like classic. You mentioned the 1960s. You definitely have a kind of a throwback physique for sure.
appreciate it. Yeah, that's a huge
Yeah,
compliment.
yeah.
Yeah, that means a lot. I wouldn't say I'm quite on their level. I think I would have to get a little bit leaner first just to see because they are a little bit leaner than me. I would also, yeah, I would say I have to bring up my legs, probably train my abs a little bit more and lean out a tad bit. I would also want to get my lats a little bit bigger since I know they're not at their max potential right now. I would say it's probably I think GVS has the freakiest physique. Like his arms are wild. Like his triceps are unreal. Like I've enhanced natty, whatever. It's like it's just obviously he's natty, but even comparing him to enhanced
Yeah.
guy, like nobody has a long out of the tricep like him. Alex has a very complete physique, His arms have always been a little bit of a lagging point, but they're obviously much improved at this point to where they're hardly even a lagging point anymore. His back is crazy too.
Good back. Yeah.
Um, I would say, yeah, it's probably between him and Jeff, I would say, but it really is tough to say because I think it's just a matter of preference. Like Jeff, I think Jeff looks crazy because he's like genuinely limb dominant, which you just don't see it that often. It's not that common. Then Alex is more so torso dominant, but he is probably a little bit more well rounded. But Jeff probably has more like freaky muscle groups. So it really is kind of a toss up. I'd probably go with Jeff just by a hair.
Yeah. Yeah, it looks cool. I mean, people like ask me like, "Oh, you should do a video critiquing how like they'll use lights and everything to make themselves look bigger." I'm like, enhanced people do that too. It's like nothing. Like, what are you talking about? They got to take everything they can
That's
get.
everyone.
Yeah. Another question was you kind of talk about specializing in lifts. How often are you trading out exercises?
Uh, it's to the point where I just do lifts indefinitely. Like I'll switch them out when I feel like I want to do something else. Like if I'm dreading it or getting bored of it, then I'll trade it out. But specializing in lifts, I feel is pretty underrated because you you get a lot of people that just kind of lose sight of progressive overload as a whole, and that's obviously don't want to go to that extreme either. So sticking with a lift can be very useful for that, just for accountability. I also think that your skill as far as lifting goes, where it's like you can talk about lifting being simple, but it does require coordination, especially if you're moving in like you're moving the most weight you possibly can for as many reps as you possibly can. Like it's not it's not something most people do before going to the gym. Like that's a very specific thing to do. Um, so for something like that, I think specialization can be useful because obviously once you're used to a movement, you're able to recruit obviously the most muscle fibers you can, and that's kind of what stimulates growth. So sticking with a lift is usually a good thing, especially if you've committed a good amount of time to like getting that like loading phase of mastering the technique on that lift done, especially for beginners where like some part of genetics is how good is your coordination. You get a lot of beginner lifters that have no control over their body, and part of them getting big is being able to control their body more. So sticking with a specific lift a little bit more, not just rotating the into the shiny new object that the evidence-based community put out, you know? So I think it can be useful for that. And then part of it's just moving weights that you never thought you could move. So something like a preacher curl, instead of saying, "Oh, biceps, you can't see that much progress on. I'll just try something new every couple of weeks." No, I was like, "Well, let me prove that wrong, and let me preacher curl 120 pounds." And I don't set goals like that, but it's like let me see how far I can go. And like the as you build muscle, you'll be able to move a little bit more weight. So I think those few things as a whole are main reasons why I do like to stick with lifts. I also think if a lift is really good, it's like there's no reason just to change it out for something that's inferior just for the sake of changing it. But that's very straightforward.
How much did you add on to your preacher crawl in that time period where you were really kind of documenting everything?
So when I first got my preacher bench, I was doing 75 pounds for probably 8, 9 reps, but I wasn't doing full range of motion. I was stopping at peak resistance, which makes the movement a lot easier. Like that changes everything. Eventually I ended up resetting my technique to go not quite all the way down, but pretty much I was going to like probably there. So it's like well beyond peak resistance, which is probably here. So it's like not quite a full lockout, but it's pretty much close to a full lockout. And my head, the biggest set I've ever done is 120 for 5, which was more than I've pretty much seen anyone do because nobody specializes in the preacher curl. It's not because I'm a genetic freak or anything. It's just because no one else does it. So I'm trying to kind of popularize that and show people like, look at this, you can do this. This resulted in 18-inch arms. Like, give it a try.
And Alice wanted to know what do you think the best brachialis move is?
For the brachialis, I would say having a variety of resistance profiles, not necessarily all at once, because that can just kind of bloat your program up a little bit, but cycling between, if it is a high priority, shortened and lengthened bias, neutral or semi-pronated work. Um, whether that's like something as simple as an easy bar curl, reverse grip, or like hammer curl, totally fine. Um, what I would suggest for a specific lift would be a strict hammer curl. You can do it with a dumbbell or you can do it with a cable. If you're lucky enough to have a cable where the actual cable itself is next to the post and not in front of it, you can set the cable origin to the bottom and rest your upper arm on the post and you can stand next to it and you can get a nice full range of motion. Obviously, if the cable's all the way at the bottom, it's going to be a short bias lift. I'd say probably bias the short stuff for the brachialis and the brachioradialis. They're likely going to have better leverage in the shorter positions. But I would also factor in some mid to lengthen bias work, so maybe like a dumbbell hammer preacher curl or even like a box curl where you're just like literally setting your arm on like a bench or a box at this, so peak tension is at the bottom at a full 180-degree extension. It's kind of cycling through those and maybe biasing more of your time to the short bias stuff is probably what I would do, since you're probably already training your biceps at a longer length anyways. Um, but yeah, those are kind of the principles of brachialis training, I would say.
Did you say you follow the pros? Did you watch Olympia at all? Do you follow any of the pro bodybuilding?
I did for a while, but I haven't really followed it in a couple years. Um, although I'm always curious about the results though, because I do still find it interesting. I saw it was Samson Dauda that won Open, right?
Yeah.
And then 212 had to be Keown, was it?
Oh yeah. Yeah, by like a
That
mile.
guy
Yeah.
is crazy.
Yeah, I seen him
Unbelievable.
in person in Dallas working out a couple times when I was out
Oh,
there.
unreal. I
Yeah,
remember
he's
watching
freaky.
him when he first came onto the scene, probably like 8 years ago. Maybe not when he first came on, but when he first started like
Yeah.
get a little bit more popular. Like I remember watching those Nick Strength and Power videos from like 2016 or 2017 talking about him, and you were just like, holy moly, like this guy's got potential. Because he used to compete. Was it classic physique he started out in?
I think he turned pro natty. I think he was one of these guys that just a
Well,
freak of nature turned pro classic natty and then
yeah.
hopped on. And then you can really see what it's like when a true freak of nature hops on because I'm
Oh,
sure everybody thought he was on juice before.
he is absolutely a freak of nature. He's a shorter guy, isn't he?
Yeah, he's about 5'5".
5'5", yeah. A lot of the time they're about that height. I find that guys that are a little bit shorter than that, like Sean Clarida, or it might be Sean Clarita.
Yeah.
He's like super short. He's like 5'2" or something.
And he might even be smaller, but yeah, he's listed as 5'2".
Yeah, you can tell like the proportions at that point do change quite a bit. He still looks
Not,
unbelievable.
yeah, he's got decent proportions for that height, but yeah, normally like some of those shorter like bikini girls and stuff, you'd be like, huh, that's a little weird looking with some of the stubby little legs sometimes. Uh,
Yeah, crazy physique, but I find that for like that perfect balance, it's probably like between 5'5" and like 5'10" is what most of those guys are. Obviously, you have
yeah,
some guys like maybe Chris Bumstead or something where he's probably what 6'1", 6'2",
yeah, yeah,
where he has like he doesn't have the same like muscle bellies. Like you can even just look at his arms; they're not nearly going to be as good as someone like Phil Heath, who's probably 5'10" or 5'9". Um, but they have like the skeleton structure. They have that massive like shoulder to shoulder measurement, and they're just like somehow have a tiny waist and whatnot. And you're just like, yeah, that's like a Superman build. But then if you're talking like just freak of nature bodybuilding proportions overall, it's like if you're kind of in that mid to tall 5 foot range, seems like they're always there.
yeah. Samson finally beat them this year. You know, he's 6 foot, but it's been Hottie and Derek the last 3 years, last couple years, trade in. They were former 212 guys. Is
Crazy
there
to see
anything,
12 guys go
dude?
up to that.
I know. I really, well, I think they should just kind of get rid of 212, honestly, at least in the Olympia, and
Yeah.
let him go against with the big boys. Because Keon would probably be fifth in the Open right now. You know, he's that good. He probably would have been fourth or fifth.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a weird like happy medium between it's I feel like it's either like huge classic physique guys or it's just just uh just like shorter open bodybuilders. And it's like at
Yeah,
that point,
it is.
even if they are 212, like proportionally, like FFMI wise, they're way up there with the big boys.
That's interesting. That's true right now. I haven't thought about it. There is like a lot of guys who've had to go to 212 from classic, and then you have just the stocky as fuck, 5 foot
Yeah.
four guys that are maxing out. So it is kind of interesting because there's some aesthetic guys now that used to not be in 212 at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say the one guy that I've always liked his physique would be Wesley. I remember
Yeah.
seeing him first come up years back and seeing his video of like his transformation from being a UPS driver and like lifting as a hobby to like taking it seriously. And he's like, "Oh, I'm a genetic freak, actually. Didn't know that."
Yeah.
I mean, if it wasn't for like I feel like they just don't like him because he has like a bigger waist, but his lats and arms are unreal. Like I don't know if it gets much better than that. It's like he doesn't have the lowest insertions or anything, but just like if you just look at like how wide and how much they pop out, it's unbelievable, I think.
Yeah, his rear delts and triceps and like in a back double are pretty detailed. It's pretty nutty looking.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's kind of a disappointment. He won the Arnold, so a lot of people thought he would challenge Bumstead, but he didn't get to stand next to him. I think he tried to come in two conditions. A lot of these
I almost think he looks a little bit better. It's for me personally, I don't care as much about like the V taper and the waist and everything. It's like there's something I like about a physique like that. It's his legs are not quite on like Chris Bumstead's level, but I'm almost inclined to say like I kind of think his upper body, at least from the front, is a little bit better.
Yeah, he would
Like
have got
as much
compared
as
if
a
he came
physique
in the
that might be.
same as he did at the Arnold. He would have gotten right next to Chris, which would have been cool because he's bigger and there's no one ever bigger standing next to Chris. But next year he's got his chance to come back.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's wide open next year.
Is there anything else you want to cover at all before I let you go, buddy? Any topic you want to hit or anything?
No, I think we're good. I mean, you asked a bunch of good questions. I feel like I had a good opportunity to say what I wanted to. So I appreciate that. Appreciate you having
Yeah,
me on. It's a good talk.
appreciate you coming on, man. Thanks a lot. If there's anything you ever need, just let me know, and then maybe we can do it again whenever there's some big study that comes out that shakes the natty world up or something.
Yeah, sounds good, man.
All right, cool. I appreciate your time, man.
Likewise.
All right, thanks.